The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hi, this is Ken Gidge, and this is The Art of Politics. Tonight we have Bill Gardner, the Secretary of State. First, let me introduce him. He was born in New Hampshire, went to high school, I believe, in Manchester, UNH, London School of Economics, University of North Carolina, Harvard. And so, Mr. Secretary, how are you? And 3 terms you were elected as a state representative. 3 terms, so you got out of college, all this education. Why weren't you out earning money instead of getting into politics? That happened.
I was in college from 1966 to 1970. I graduated from the University of New Hampshire in 1970. And it was a tumultuous period of time. Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. It was the first Earth Day. We had the strikes across the country, Kent State. At the university, we had 3 of the Chicago 7 members scheduled to speak, and it just so happened to be the day after Kent State, when the students were killed on the campus there in Ohio. So it was quite a period of time to be.
That was at UNH.
In college, yeah. And
how did you end up at
product of the civil, the civil rights movement. It was the voting rights movement. It was the Vietnam War, and in my junior year, I was elected president of the senior class.
At UNH?
At UNH. So I was involved in a lot of events on the campus. It was a very unique period of time. The school, the students went on strike. And for the last 5 weeks of the semester, students could either take the grade that they had at the time and then go out and leaflet or canvass, or they could continue going to classes. And the student union building sort of got taken over as the student living building. A lot of commuters actually brought their sleeping bags there.
I don't think people understand at that particular, because I was in there too. The Vietnam War, landing on the moon. I mean, people don't quite understand that everybody says that 10 years of let's say a decade, but it's nothing like, last part of the 50s, the early part of the 70s. That was landing on the moon. I mean, that ended the 60s.
Yeah, that was in 69.
How did you graduated from UNH when?
1970. And when I was there, I couldn't vote. I couldn't vote at all during my 4 years because I wasn't old enough. So I cast my first vote in a New Hampshire September primary of 1970. I graduated 3 or 4 months before that, and I
graduated
really
before
wanted
you were
to
18,
vote. I really wanted to vote desperately. I had 2 classmates in my high school that were killed in Vietnam, and I had a good friend that lived just down the street from me who stepped on a mine there, and he lost his leg from the knee down. So there was a lot of things impacting young people's lives in those during those years, and I, as a result of that, I had to speak to alumni groups to try to explain what was happening on campus.
As the class president. Yes.
And as a result of it, I decided after that that I'd run for the legislature. And so I was elected in 1972 to the House. And and in that first year, the legislature began in January then, not December like it is now. And that first year, the age of majority was reduced from 21 to 18. Then the voting age was reduced. So a lot of the things happened, and the next election, we had the closest U.S. Senate race in the country's history. Here in 1974. On election night, the Republican candidate won by 355 votes. The Democratic candidate asked for a recount, and after the recount, the Democratic candidate was declared the winner by 10 votes. So the United States Senate was sent a certificate saying that the Democrat had won the U.S. Senate race. After the recount, the Ballot Law Commission reviewed a number of protested ballots, and they decided that the Republican had really won by 2 votes. So a second certificate was sent to the U.S. Senate from New Hampshire saying that, oops, the Republican really did
somehow
win.
I can see how the Secretary of State's job would interest you.
Not the Democratic, candidate by 10 votes. So the U.S. Senate asked to have all of the ballots in New Hampshire sent to Washington. So they were all shipped down to Washington, and the Senate Rules Committee started doing their own recount. And as they were doing that recount, more senators began to ask to be a part of it. So eventually it reached a point where all U.S. senators on the floor of the Senate were facing the fact that they were going to be voting individually on ballots and whether to count a ballot a certain way or not. And that went on for over 5 months. And in the meantime, New Hampshire was not represented by a second senator. So
how did that affect you? You did go to these other colleges. Now, the first time you were, when you were elected as state representative, you had just been to UNH. Have you been to the other schools?
Well, in the 70s, I have a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School at Harvard, and but I wasn't originally at the Kennedy School there. I was at the Arts and Sciences, the graduate school. So, but I was in the legislature. because I was
doing
elected.
both. I didn't know that.
I was in the legislature. When I first ran, I actually won the nomination of both parties in the primary. So I won the election, and when I won the nomination at the primary, I was 23. And so I served those 2 years, and then in 1974, I ran again. And in 1974, we had that election, the closest U.S. Senate race ever. I was on the elections. I was on the committee. It was called Statutory Revision, but all the election bills went to that committee. And so, and it was a busy committee because as you can imagine, having a close U.S. Senate race, the whole election process was put under a microscope. Everything was looked at, really scrutinized. And some things came to light. For instance, it wasn't uncommon for candidates to go to the city or town clerk's offices and get 25 ballots. Not applications, but 25 absentee ballots. So what came to light was that candidates were actually distributing ballots to people, either at nursing homes or other facilities.
So that was really...
So a lot of people, once they got to realize that, were not happy. And that led to reforming the absentee ballot process, that no longer could a candidate just go, or anybody just go pick up ballots and get them to vote and then bring the ballots back, that a person who wanted an absentee ballot would have to apply for it. And there would be a signature on the application. And then when the ballot was returned, there'd be a signature on the affidavit envelope.
Okay, so
that was a reform that came from the U.S. Senate election. There were a number of other reforms. The ballots, when the ballots came back to the State House after the election for the recount here in New Hampshire, the state police were bringing the ballots back, and some of those boxes were not standard boxes. Some of those boxes opened up when the police were actually bringing the ballots into the State House, and some of them they were chasing on the lawn in front of the State House.
That sounds...
So there were a lot of concerns raised about the actual process of voting and then counting and then tallying and then reporting. So
you got voted in
on the elections committee,
correct?
We got a lot of bills. Like this last time, there were maybe 100 election bills. That year, there were a lot of bills that came before the legislature because of the spotlight being put on New Hampshire with this close U.S. Senate race. So the election was in '74. In the spring of '75, 5.5 months later, the U.S. Senate said, we can't do this. We can't figure out who won this election. What do you want to do about this? And so the decision was that we would do it all over again. And I was part of a group that was from the election the committee that dealt with all the election laws to look at how we would actually do it. And the first question was, well, who would participate in this? Would it only be the candidates that were on the ballot the first time? Or would this be opened up to new candidates? The second question was, how about the voters? Do we only let the voters who voted in the first election now vote in this rerun of the election? Or do we open it up to any new voter that wants to vote in the rerun?
But stop. We've got so much to talk about. I can see how you have such an interest in it. Is that how you got into being Secretary of State? Is that why you decided? How did you become Secretary of State?
Well, as a result of all these bills, whenever I spoke on the floor of the House, it was always on an election bill. So House members knew that I had an interest in elections. They knew that I had a passion. I cared about this. And so most of those bills failed. I actually, got up and talked about more training sessions with local election officials. I talked about producing a layman's guide to the election laws, which has turned into the election training manual, that when you came to the training session this summer, you had a copy of that in layman's terms, what all the election laws really mean. So some of those things that we have today came about back then. And so after but most of those ideas were defeated in that legislative session. So the election was 74 in November. The rerun was September 15th of 75. And then the next year, 76, was an election year. And I ran for the legislature the third time. And after the filing period in June, the Secretary of State died in office. And
that was one of the very first, let me stop you for a second. That was one of the very first mistakes that the person who was running against you, Colin Van Osten, said you ran against him, which was not fact.
No, I never ran against an incumbent. He was never defeated as Secretary of State. He had been elected in 1960 because of a very similar situation. The Secretary of State died.
So he died.
The one before him.
Your secretary.
So when I became Secretary of State, on the day I became Secretary of State, there was no person alive who had ever been Secretary of State.
So for
now
you
that's pretty rare when you have 15 former attorney generals and 18 speakers of the House, even governors. Sometimes you have 6, sometimes you have 8 that are former. But that office is a very different office in state government. It's traditionally been very different. So in the summer, the Secretary of State died, and the Deputy Secretary of State announced that he didn't want the position. And so it was an open seat. And after I announced sometime in November, and that...
Were the Democrats or the Republicans, who was the majority then?
The Republicans were in the majority.
So Republicans and Democrats voted for you.
Yeah.
And you became a Secretary of State, and with your education, obviously, and your great interest, and as you said, doing most of what we read right now, it gave you a good beginning.
Well, when I became Secretary of State, because the legislative session before, at that time, the legislature met only 6 months every 2 years.
I see. So you had plenty of time to...
It didn't meet every year like it does now.
Okay.
So you could be doing other things at the time in school. You could. So the legislature, in 1976, when I was elected, a lot of the bills that had been defeated 2 years earlier, there were more time for people to give consideration to them. And so there was quite a package of bills. And so in 1977, the year you get elected in the fall of '66, and then the legislature starts getting busy in January. Like this year, this is 2018, but it'll be January 2019 that you'll be doing a lot of your business, all the public hearings. And so a lot of the same bills were introduced again. And at that point, most of them actually became law. Most of them became law. So the idea of the training sessions, the idea of the manual, a number of things. For instance, in the election of '76, there was a question on the ballot that would give an absolute right to an individual to vote by absentee ballot in a town election. They didn't have that right before that, but there was a question on that ballot in '76 that asked if the people of this state wanted it, and 2/3 voted for that. So there have been some changes not only to the statutes, but in the Constitution.
We're going to take a short break, and we're going to get back to you on this. You're giving us really the basis of what we're in today. We're going to move a little bit fast. We're going to take a break. This is Ken Gidge. This is The Art of Politics. We'll be back in a moment. This is Ken Gidge. We just took a small break. We have the Secretary of State, Bill Gardner, here. And if you missed the first half, it is the explanation of how Nashua, New Hampshire has formed. And obviously this gentleman has done a great deal. Mr. Secretary, and what, now let's get back to, you were saying that.
So when I was first elected, I had the experience in the legislature on the committee that dealt with all the election bills. I also had worked at a polling place. So I had been part of the polling activity at the polls. And I think that what helped me when I ran the first time was because people can get up on the floor of the House and talk about all kinds of different bills, but I didn't do that. I talked about election bills, and I talked about the reforming of some of our election laws because of things that came to light when the whole election was put under a microscope. I mean, just think about this. We had more people vote in that special election in September, when it was the only thing on the ballot to go to vote for, than had voted in November, 10 months before, when you had not only U.S. Senate, you had governor and Congress and all the county and state Senate. And so, because there was a lot of attention. At the time, the president was Gerald Ford, and he did sort of a whistle-stop tour right across the southern part. There was a lot of national attention on this Senate election here. So anyway, that led, I became Secretary of State, a lot of bills were put in, and there's been a lot of water under the dam.
You know, we've talked about this before. We really do have to do it, and we do want to do a whole history because you have so much information that is just so crucial to what people have to know. But you're up for election now, and Colin Van Osten, who's running, opposing against you, is.
And the other thing that I could just. The presidential primary was a big issue in the early 70s because, and that's important to know up to this day.
Why?
Because New Hampshire.
Why is it important?
Well, because in 1968 we had a primary that shocked the country.
Why?
Because a person who no one thought had a prayer ended up winning more delegates. This was Eugene McCarthy.
Eugene McCarthy.
He was running against an incumbent.
And you were the Secretary of State then?
No. Lyndon Johnson. And what happened was with that upset, people were amazed. They said the little guy can actually
Here in New Hampshire.
make a difference. Yes, but across the country,
First
people were saying
primary
it.
in...
The presidential primary of '68
and you always
had a huge
made
impact.
sure.
It had a huge impact.
Yeah.
And as a result of that primary, 2 weeks after, the President of the United States went on on television and announced, "I'm not running anymore. I'm all done." And the people in the country were like, "This is unbelievable."
So you were Secretary of State.
No, I wasn't then in '68.
I'm trying to
just
get
giving
you to be Secretary.
No, so what happened was, when that happened, states began to come after New Hampshire. And the first state to do it was Nevada. And the person who led the effort was a 27-year-old Harry Reid. And he put a
They
bill in.
wanted
The bill
first
passed that Nevada
state.
would have, this was in 1969, that in 1972, the next presidential election year, that Nevada would have its primary 1 week ahead of New Hampshire. And that passed the House and it passed the Senate. But the governor of Nevada vetoed it. And years later, I found out why he vetoed it, because the Secretary of State of Nevada sent me the whole file on it. And he said he didn't want to create ill will with a sister state. He didn't want to do something that in 4 years some other state would take it away. So that began the issue of the presidential primary. A year and a half after that, 69, and in 71, Florida legislature decides we don't have to have it a week before New Hampshire. But if we have it on the same day, where do you think the candidates would rather be in December, January?
So what happened?
So that passed. So New Hampshire
passed who?
Passed the legislature,
In Concord?
became law in Florida.
Florida.
So now New Hampshire was faced with, what do we do about
So
this?
what happened?
And New Hampshire changed
Who made the law?
the
Who
date
passed
of
the
the
law?
town meeting day, so that we went 1 week ahead of Florida in 1972.
And ahead of everyone from that moment on, by 1 week.
And then what happened, the other New England states in 73 and 74 and 75 talked about having a New England regional New Hampshire presidential primary, presidential primary. A New England, not just a New Hampshire. And that's when a legislator put a bill in to separate the primary from town meeting day. And the legislation actually said that if another New England state did this, New Hampshire would have to have its primary a week ahead. So in 1975, there was, for the first time in the law, the Secretary of State was given the authority to set the date of the primary if it was necessary to keep the tradition alive.
Which was you.
It wasn't me then, but I came in the next year.
And
I came in 76.
And
So-
by the way, I have been in there, and for people who don't know, when candidates come in, you have a real, let's say, interesting way. First of all, when a candidate comes in, you make sure they see all the pictures. And everybody looks around at the pictures. And then you make sure, oh, you do know we're the first in the nation. And of course you will back us. It's wonderful to watch this go on. It's amazing how that happens. And so far, is there anyone who hasn't agreed with you when they came in on that?
Well, the candidates have been because the candidates, the best thing we have is what happens here. The candidates' experience here. Candidates remember what happened here compared to, because once
it's
they
small.
leave here, everything's pretty much the same.
Yes.
But this is very unique to most people.
Oh,
what happens
400
So,
representatives?
Ever since that law in 75, we've had battles almost every 4 years, and sometimes it's been other states, sometimes it's been the national parties. There's been bills introduced in Congress to try to stop this.
The question I have to ask you right now is, do you want to be Secretary of State again? Do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
Then there's some people.
in a year and a half,
I'm going to ask you some hard questions.
in a year and a half,
because they want to know. I'm going to ask you some hard questions.
so
We've got to
from
move on.
76,
I'm mad now.
we've had situations where two states at the same time passed legislation putting into their state law that their presidential primary had to be on the same day as New Hampshire whenever New Hampshire had it. So, because our law doesn't say that the primary has to be a certain day, and it doesn't say how to actually carry out the law.
Mr. Secretary, we're going to take a break. This is Ken Gidge. This is The Art of Politics. We'll be back in a moment. Hi, this is Ken Gidge. This is The Art of Politics. We have the Secretary of State sitting right here. You know, you got so much history. Again, we're going to have to do a lot of work on it. It's just amazing because you have such a bed of what's taking place. But a couple things, as a Democrat, Democrats are not happy with you. Democrats were mad when you finally said no. When the Trump Commission came out to study illegal voting, and the committee was formed, and they asked everyone around the country to join, and they asked you, and you said yes. All the Democrats went nuts. Why were you doing that? You didn't have to do that. In fact, it cost, everybody was mad at you for doing that. And finally, you go to the first meeting and you pay your own way. Doesn't cost the state anything. You go to the first meeting in Washington, and as you're walking that way, do you run into someone kind of special? Like the president?
Well, I was walking down the hall, and a pretty wide hall, and this door opened about 2 feet from me on my right-hand side. And who opened the door but the president? He was just,
Did they introduce you to him?
well, when we made eye contact, I was surprised, and I think he was surprised. Then I said, well, I saw you when you filed a while back. Do you remember that? And he says, oh, I remember all that. I remember the desk and the history, and then he started in a little bit about the voting.
Oh,
and when he did
you should have done that.
I said, let me just explain to you how our voting process is in New Hampshire. I said, when someone comes in to vote, if they have an ID, they should show the ID. If they don't, if someone recognizes them, that's okay. Then they can vote. If no one recognizes them, and I mentioned, I said our polling places are very different than most of the country. I said we're at one end, Florida is at the other. I said in Florida, everyone that works in the polling place, they're all appointed officials. In New Hampshire, and they don't vote in the polling place. But in New Hampshire, everyone who works in the polling place votes in that polling place. They've got skin in the game. It's their polling place.
So what did he say?
So
he gave you that time? Surprises me.
And so I said, and then I said, so if no one recognizes the person and the person doesn't have an ID, that person can still vote. That person signs an affidavit, and the person has his or her picture taken. And he goes, picture taken?
He didn't know it.
And I said, yes, that picture. He says, I've never heard of such a thing. You really do that? And I said, yes. We are the only state in the country that does that. But I said, think about it. Do you think some person who shouldn't be doing this will stand in a public building and let their picture be taken? And he was just, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. So that's an example of, I was on that commission to defend the state, because if we did not, first of all, I didn't know that I was going to be asked about that. I never asked anybody. I was never, I had nothing to do with it.
You didn't know the president was, okay,
so what happened is that we had the first, it wasn't a meeting, but we had a conference call. And that conference call, we were all on the call, but we weren't together. We were all in our own states. And the vice president at the beginning of that conference call said, now I expect that this group, there'll be spirited debates. There'll be a lot of discussion. There'll be disagreement. But all I'm asking is that we all try to reach common ground.
But you can understand why people are absolutely nuts that you went there. You went you finally met when you met the president. That was the first meeting. Now the question is, the second meeting I think is probably what people don't know about.
At the very beginning, I thought about this, and I thought about, is it better for someone from the state to be there, or is it better to just not be there? And I'd rather be at the table than on the menu. And I wanted to be able to defend the state because the state had nothing.
Why did people feel the same way you did? Why did the Democrats feel different than you?
That's, I guess, some people have a different perspective on that. But for me, I've always believed that you should give people a chance to have their say. Listen, don't just ignore people that you don't like or you don't agree with, or in a diverse society like ours, with self-government, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, how can you not be willing to sit down? You don't have to give up your values and your beliefs and and even worse, if we didn't, the argument would be, well, what are they afraid of? They're afraid of, they've got something. See, they really do have these problems.
Yes, but the Democrats are looking at it and saying you're kind of a traitor by going there. You're saying no. Okay, let's go to the point now. The second meeting is held at the university.
At St. Anselm's.
St. Anselm's. It was the second meeting of the Trump Commission.
Right.
You invited them, or they asked if they could come, and you said yes.
Well, the first meeting was in Washington.
Yes.
This was the first meeting to go outside of Washington. And New Hampshire, because New Hampshire is looked at from the rest of the country in a way that, we have well-run elections here. We have the spotlight every 4 years on our presidential primary. None of them have ever had any scandals associated, or flaws, or miscounts, or delayed counts. There's never been an experience like that. People trust the process that we have here.
We come here, and let me please, because I'll tell you what, you have a problem. You know what the problem is? You're too humble. People, and I've said this to people, they don't understand it. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened was when they came here, you got into sort of like not an argument. Now, this is right in New Hampshire. And then it was kind of a debate, and when you got done, people applauded, the meeting ended, and that was the last meeting of the Trump Commission, was right here in New Hampshire. I said you should have got some credit for that. Republicans, the Republicans and Democrats, a lot of them said you should have got credit for it. You didn't get credit for it, Bill. You're just too humble when it comes to things like that.
There were some things that were said at that meeting. And because I was there, it's no accident that it was in New Hampshire. It was in New Hampshire. It wouldn't have been in New Hampshire if I was not on that commission. But it was in New Hampshire. And there were some things that had been said that were not true. And I had let people on the commission know that there are certain things that were out there that were not true.
And what happened?
And so at that meeting, when those things that I had already said were not true were said again as if they were true. I waited until the remarks were finished, and then I said, we had a valid election. We had a fair election, and which was contrary to what was spoken just before that. So, and then the Secretary of State of Maine spoke after me and said something very similar. And as you said, that was the last time that that commission.
See, one of the reasons why you're here is because Colin Van Osten has $250,000. You took nothing. You've always believed that money doesn't belong there, and ethically, money does not belong in the Secretary of State's office. He has $250,000. What people don't know, Mr. Secretary, is what happened. They complained, they gave you a hard time. I heard the Democrats, oh, he's an awful person, going that and doing that. Nobody knew. A lot of people didn't know the second and last of the Trump commission ended here. And as you said, if you didn't go, it wouldn't have happened. And you never got credit for it, and you don't want to take credit for it. And it upsets a couple of people like me. And one more thing, would you like to talk? So what happened? At that meeting, what finally you saw that it was done? Did you see it at that meeting that it was finished?
Well, when at the end of that meeting, the Secretary of State of Maine, Matt Dunlap, we talked about the exchange and what had happened. See, we had been told at the beginning that we could not communicate with each other about matters pertaining to this Presidential Integrity Commission. Became more widely known as the Voter Fraud Commission, but the official name of it was the Election Integrity Commission. So we talked about some of the things that had happened that day, and after that day, there wasn't anything anymore. I mean, it was
So it ended here in New Hampshire.
In effect, it ended on that day because there was nothing.
But, you know, Democrats didn't want you to go and you bring it back here, and then it ends here. And there's a lot of people that I know who didn't know this, and that's one of the things I wanted to get out. One of the other things I think is very, very important was that you are being accused of being an individual who is trying to make it more difficult for people to vote in the state of New Hampshire. And people are very upset. Oh, wait a minute. Well, no, hold on. Let me take their side on this. And they're saying they're really, really mad. How could you do that? You went and you talked to the hearings and you something passed and then, but where's New Hampshire? Where is it right now? Is it the hardest state in the United States to vote in? Yes or no?
No, it's not.
Is it the easiest?
It is the easiest. And it is the easiest.
Why are they mad at you?
Factual reasons.
Why are they mad at you? Why? If that is the truth, why aren't they getting it? You know why? Because you're so humble. That's the problem. I'm worried. Everybody's worried. Bill, Mr. Secretary, you made sure that it is the easiest state in the United States to vote in. People don't know that. People have accused you of making it difficult, and they're spending money against you. And the only thing you're doing is defending yourself, but with your ethics. It's very frustrating. And one of the reasons why you've been where you are for 42 years is simple. Is because you do nothing to offend the Republicans. You never said once that, hey, it ended here. You've never said to the Democrats, hey, guess what? I helped it. I did it. And then somebody comes along with a lot of money. And it really hurts for me to see that. One question, a number of questions. money in this as the Secretary of State. Tell me why, tell people why it hurts so much, the Secretary of State.
Well, the Secretary of State, it's not a policy position. It's not you don't make policy, you don't create laws.
And
you carry out
yeah.
what the legislature and the governors in the past and present have.
But that's not what your opponent's saying.
So it's not a policy position. And there are, do I testify in the legislature? Yes. I always have testified on bills that deal with the duties of the office. And there's 18 articles in the Constitution, 18, that reference the Secretary of State. Other than the Speaker, Senate President, and the Governor, there's no other position in state government that has anything close to that. Most don't have any in the Constitution. So the legislature expects me to do this. Now,
expects anybody to do this.
Anybody in the position.
Do you need some education? I mean, do you need some knowledge to become Secretary of State? I mean, it seems like your opponent has been on the Governor's Council, but that's it.
Well, the elections are the most significant part of the office. So
how did this last election go? The largest turnout in the history over the primaries. That's almost impossible to happen. How did that go? How did that work out for the state?
Well, it was 85,000 more voters than the last midterm, and that midterm had been the highest vote that we had, and we haven't had a population increase in 4 years anywhere near that. People wanted to come out to vote.
Were there problems?
It is easy to come out to vote. We are the easiest state in the country to vote because we are the only state that has election day registration at the polling place. We have no provisional ballots. There's only 3 other states in the country that don't have provisional ballots. The closest state to New Hampshire, to us, that is like us, that does not have provisional ballots is Minnesota. That's how far away it is. None of the states around us do not have, and they're all mandated.
It's the easiest place in the United States to vote in. Why are people saying that you are trying to make it harder? Why? If it's the easiest place. Is there some problem? Is a mix-up? People don't have the information. They don't understand the process. And they're going to be voting on this.
If you, that's a really good question. And it's a question that has made me question how did it get like this, and how do you deal with something like this? Because
so how do you deal with it? How do you deal with it?
Across the country, for the last 10 years, all the national polls that have asked the question, do you believe there's a problem with the election? Do you believe that there's fraud in the election?
Yes.
All those polls, half the people in the country answer that yes. And a lot of people say, well, this is just not reality. It's just not reality. But they answer the question yes. So there are things out there that a lot of people believe, but that when you dig down into it,
not far.
It's not really reality.
I want to just say something.
And what is the measure of an election? How do you measure? What is the grand evaluator?
How it ends up.
How many people actually vote? Because
how's the voting? How is our voting in New Hampshire?
Our voting is at the top of the country.
What top of what country? Is there a study or something on that?
Well, if you go back.
Right now, what is this?
In the last presidential election, 2016, we had the second highest in the country on voting, eligible population voting.
In the second,
and we had the third highest in the country based on voting age population.
Okay.
And the difference is voting age is every human being in the state over the age of 18.
And they voted.
And that's the denominator. And voting eligible takes out non-citizens, Census Bureau numbers.
So what
and the-
else were we were? Okay, so we're
So-
second, third. Were we first on anything?
Well, we have been second and third and third and third and fourth and fifth, going back like
Recently,
6 presidential elections.
have we been anything first?
We've been, well, we have been first for something.
Give me
Is this
the cell
mine?
phone.
I don't know this. Oh,
Okay.
I don't know why. I thought I had shut it off.
Okay.
Sorry. This,
We were, for the Harvard, didn't they say we were number one for counting votes? Didn't we
2
say
years
that
ago,
we were?
there was a study at Harvard, 9 categories for elections. 2 of the 9 categories, we were first. Of those 2 that we were first, 1 we were first. No one
Yes,
tied with
yeah.
us. The other one, there was a state that would tied with us.
So
But
if
the
it-
category that we were first was the impartiality of the process, the transparency of the process, the openness of it.
But wait a minute. Whoa, hold on a second. Colin Van Austin is saying that's not true. We're not open. We're not transparent.
Well,
That you need we need an audit. Have you had an audit recently, or?
we had an audit within the last 2 years.
Well, why doesn't he know that if that's the truth? Is he just putting that out there?
We had a performance and a financial, and it was all election related, and we had to go back.
But he said that
2003
he said that you hired 100 extra people.
Well,
Is that true?
No, it's not true.
Why would he say that?
I don't know why.
Why does it tell me? I'm asking. I'm going to ask. Why is he saying? You have to know. Why is he saying that the elections are not right? That things aren't going good. That you've got to upgrade, modernize. Haven't we done any modernizing recently?
Yeah, he was referring to the corporate division.
Yes.
And he said that we still have we still use rotary telephones.
Still rotary telephones.
Well, as a matter of fact,
Don't tell me you have a rotary telephone. Don't tell me that.
it was a rotary when I first got there, but
Yes, if you did know Abraham Lincoln.
93% of all transactions in New Hampshire's corporate division are done online. The average in the country is 53%. That's 40% below us. There's a couple states better than us, but we're at the top.
But he's saying we're not.
Well, I know, but
So he doesn't know what he's talking about? Is he lying or?
well,
what do you think?
The statistics I'm giving you are true statistics.
Okay.
They are true. The
archives, how's that doing? Is that decrepit and falling
vital
apart?
records, we have a state of, we are connected. We have what's called Neverin, which is the vital records. All the town clerks in the state are connected
Yeah.
by computers to our Neverin system that they can get birth records, death records for elections. We have a statewide database where all the checklists are all in
So
one
that's all
database.
modernized.
All the clerks have
it's all
access to
modernized.
that.
But why is he saying it's not modernized? Why? Is he lying? Is he not telling the truth? Why isn't anybody asking him? And I guess that's probably what the show is about. Because, Mr. Secretary, I have talked to people who said they won't go and talk to you because they're worried you're going to lie to them. That hurts me. They say they don't want to go to you because they've already made up their mind. And I said, excuse me, if you haven't talked to one person, and ethically he doesn't believe money should be in it, and the other has $250,000, wouldn't you talk to both candidates? Does this make sense to you? This must make you, after your years of service, it must be very frustrating to see this. And it's frustrating to a lot of people.
Well, there's a little bit of time left. I'm taking advantage the most I can for the day.
And people
I couldn't do it in the summer. I
your
couldn't
cell
do it
phone,
during the recount.
we're going to give them your telephone number. Is that okay? We're going to put out your telephone number because they can get the state number for the Secretary of State, but we're going to put out your cell phone number. And the whole idea is if anybody's got any questions to talk to you or question what we have been talking about, and there's so much more. We could go on for hours of things. But I think what's the frustrating thing to me, to be honest with you, is the money. That's all. Because the fact is, what a lot of people don't know who are watching this show is they gave money to his campaign, thinking that they could vote in his campaign. He had to spend money to tell people they couldn't vote in his campaign, when the only people who can vote in the campaign are myself, an elected representative, and a senator. That's it. 424. He's running a campaign as if he's running for governor. And
I've never taken a cent. I've never raised money. I've never had a political action committee. From the first time I ran, the person before me didn't take any. The person before him didn't take any. The other two states that have it elected the same way, Maine and Tennessee, they don't take any. As a matter of fact, in the state of Maine, they had a scandal over money for one of the constitutional offices elected by the legislature about a dozen years ago. And the legislature was so taken back by it that they not only prohibited any kind of fundraising for offices that are elected by this smaller number of people, but they said you couldn't even sit in a room. If somebody was discussing it, you had to walk out. So they went even...
We're going to go probably five minutes over. Look, all your years of service, I would think that people would at least take the time to go in and say, that hurts. Well, because I have had experience, because we did work with from the corporate division, I'm in commerce, to securities. So I've got to know how everything works. It's not easy. You make it look easy, or it looks easy. But I can't imagine anybody walking in and thinking that they can step right into that. Does that worry you? If somebody with no experience stepped in it, what would happen?
Well, what is of greatest concern to me is changing the tradition of this office and the way this office has been for decades and decades and decades. This is not a political office. This office does not make policy. This is an office that is the most unique in state government, because you have one foot in the executive branch and the other foot in the legislative branch. You scan two branches. Separation of powers, that's a huge principle. But this office constitutionally straddles it. And because of that, and because you want elections to be as honest as humanly possible, and fair, and everyone treated the same, and everyone feel and believe that the process is going to be one that is operated and conducted like that. And you don't need to...
You know, somebody has said a while back that you're old, you're decrepit, you ought to be thrown under the bus. Oh, wait a minute. There was not 15 years ago when you said no to all the money to buy new machines, electronic machines. Did you get in a little trouble because you didn't want them?
Well, at that time, the argument was that it wasn't modern.
But you were old. You were old and decrepit then.
But now all the states, almost every state that bought those machines 12, 15 years ago, state of the art, have all junked them. And their money is gone. They've spent all their money and they've gone back to paper. Maryland went all back to paper. Virginia went all back to paper, state after state after state. So at that time, it was not fashionable to say, oh no, we're going to stick with paper. Oh, you're not modern. You're not. You need to be
Yes,
up to speed.
but Mr. Secretary, hold on a second. I'm just watching how it said, oh, New Hampshire's leading the way in the United States with paper ballots, and somebody says they've always used paper ballots up there. So my point is, you're kind of old-fashioned. Like, let's do it right. Let's try to keep the money out of it. Let's have something that we can count on. Well, we got about 3 more minutes. Anything you would like to say to the people out there? Is there something you'd like to say to the voters, people who are going to vote for you?
Well, I mentioned earlier about the presidential primary and how the fight to keep it began, and about the law the law simply says the presidential primary must be 7 or more days ahead of any other state that has a similar
And nobody's going to get away with that.
But the law doesn't give you a roadmap how to do it. And it doesn't say, well, if you have 3 states that now have laws saying it's going to be the same day, you push this button and take care of it, or you push that button. And it doesn't say when one of the national parties says you're not going to have delegates at the convention unless you violate.
So the Secretary of State has a very important
your
moment
law.
there.
I was faced with those kinds of issues over the years, and it's very important to be able to work with both sides, or 3 sides, if that's what you have to.
And that is the reason why you have lasted as long, because why I pushed you regarding the committee was it ended here. People didn't want you to go. It ended right here in the state of New Hampshire, the Trump Commission. You didn't raise your hand, which would offend Republicans. You didn't remind the Democrats that this is what happened. You're humble, okay? Same thing with elections. They accused you of going up there and turning around and making elections harder, except we're still the easiest. And you want to know, that just doesn't happen by accident. Mr. Secretary, I'm going to shake your hand, but I want the last word because I got a couple things to say. 2 hours before Colin said he was going to run for the Secretary of State, he called me and he wanted my advice. That conversation was private. I'm going to keep it private. I respect Colin. I like Colin. All the money that he has raised, that's all legal, okay? It's just that you have $250,000. You have a person ethically who believes, okay, that you shouldn't do that. So this is what you have, $250,000 in ethics. Does he have enough money, or does he have enough ethics? Well, it doesn't seem quite fair. So that's the only thing. As I said, I'm not going to mention what Colin and I talked about, but the thing that bothers me the most is the money. He has been running campaigns as if it's for governor, and that's a problem, because every time he says something negative, it not only goes to the Secretary of State, it looks like we up here don't know what we're doing. I didn't say I'm going to vote for this gentleman. Well, you probably know I may. I didn't say I'm not. I didn't say Colin did anything wrong. I just think it's probably the money. And if you can vote, go see the Secretary of State. Talk to him if you got a question. It's awful to hear that people are not going in and talk to the Secretary of State. That hurts. $250,000 or morally, ethically believing there should be money in it. Okay, again, thank you. This is Ken Gidge, and this has been The Art of Politics. Thanks.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.